blueberry industry. I had him speak last year at the Blueberry Commission session, and he did such a great job. I wanted to come back and talk some more. He is, in my opinion, the single most knowledgeable person that I know about frozen blueberry prices and what's going on in the frozen blueberry market. And he came to this level and because of his long service to the industry. He started working for Michigan blueberry growers 44 years ago in 1976, and he has more or less been working with MBG, Hortifruit, Nature Ripe ever since. From 2000 to 2013, he was CEO of Nature Ripe, or Nature Ripe Farms. They're the largest movers of blueberries in the world. They're in all 5 of the berries. They're the 3rd largest mover of strawberries. They also are in the frozen blueberry market, but he spends more time trying to understand the frozen market than anybody I know. And I asked him to give like a big picture talk for blueberries and raspberries. And then tomorrow during the blueberry session, he's going to give another presentation where he really dials in and focuses on blueberries. So join me in welcoming John Shelford.
Well, good morning. I really not sure why Alan invited me. I'm not sure why I said yes. I'm going to kind of skate a script today this morning because I typically on blueberries, I can get off the script real easy, but I'm much more comfortable talking about blueberries than I am so what I'm going to speak to this morning. So bottom line of it is Alan didn't give me much of a guideline, but I am honored and I'm humbled actually to be here and hear Bob Martin this morning. And I really have a huge very high regard for those folks in the horticultural and research end. From where I sat, their work is far more difficult than my work in the marketing and sales side and the administration side. And certainly the recognition of Bob this morning is humbling for me to even stand here with folks like him. And I know many of you here in the room. So I batted around a number of ideas, and it was clear at least a portion, as Alan asked me to do, would be applicable to the Washington raspberry growers. But it's been a kind of a challenge to sort out the ideas or two I'd focus on. In my 40 years in the 44 years of involvement in the U.S. and Canadian blueberry industry, there have been many expression by growers, more expression by growers of margin stress in the last 3 years than in the prior 40 years. Although my acquaintance with raspberry, strawberry, and blackberry industry is from a much greater distance, I'm hearing the same similar concerns about margin challenges that have arisen in recent years. One of the evidences of an annual crop where that's clearly evident is California strawberries. And after many years of year-on-year growth in acreage in California, since 2014-15, the acreage in California has been declining by 1,000 to 2,000 acres a year. And California is not an insignificant factor when it comes to strawberries, producing 85% of the nation's fresh strawberries for the U.S. market. Blackberry growers, and I was very much involved in the early days in Mexico when we started growing berries there, and in the southeast on the fresh side, and of course the blackberry growers here in Washington and Oregon on the frozen side. But after a number of years of good growth, they're also being threatened by margins by the crop, and particularly U.S. growers, we're hearing that in particular from them. I understand Washington raspberry growers, although comparatively and with production concentrated here in Whatcom County, are facing similar challenges. All this while the berry industry, after 30 years of tremendous growth, with the berry health message encouraging consumers, has driven sales to new records. One thing I was surprised about with the Washington frozen raspberry business, or the raspberry growers here, is that it's very concentrated. Actually, I didn't realize this in chatting with Henry this morning, that about half of the ownership here, number of owners in Washington, are actually Canadian citizens. And so you'll have to kind of forgive some of my comments, because I really talk a little bit this morning about the U.S. Import-export deal. But I have many friends, and I share this information as basically information that would be helpful for us in meeting the challenge. But how does a producer navigate in this environment, and how did we get here, and how does one move through and beyond the situation? You know, they said every person needs hope, and that's one of the challenges always, is where is the hope? And that's kind of where I put this out here today, the title, because I've got friends that I've known, particularly back in Michigan and in the Southeast, who are saying, how do we survive in this business? Where is the hope for survival? I guess I feel a little bit like Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet, when the people said, just prophesy peace, peace, or profit, profit. We don't want to hear of lack of margin. And I sense a little bit that's where we're at somewhat in our berry industry, is we don't want to hear about the challenges, but maybe we need to look at the challenges and how we face them. The challenges are complex, and they're often ill-defined. I'm sorry, I really want to stay with my text today, or I'll be in trouble with you folks. They're usually, resolutions require compromise. I'm sorry. The challenges are complex and often not well-defined, or they're ill-defined. Without exception, the challenge crosses the borders of many nations. And this is really nothing new, nations against nations. And I just remind us, the Boston Tea Party was really about trade and how we do trade. So trade wars are not new that we see, and I think we certainly see trade as one of the big challenges facing us. The resolutions are increasingly complex and difficult. Resolutions require compromise. They require what would be the not preferred allocation of scarce resources, and they require change. Change is always challenging, and in particular for legacy growers who years ago invested the resources to build the business that has for many years supported their family, community, and customers. It's not unusual to feel entitled. Although I've been away from the New York State dairy farm for over 50 years, and my father sold the dairy 30 years ago, there remains an emotional defense of the Northeast dairy farmers these days, and while many are not making it. Suicide rates are the highest they've been in the Northeast amongst dairy farmers ever, and there's many reported bankruptcies. A blueberry grower of friends in Michigan are facing challenging times. The most challenges they've faced in the 44 years that I've been in the business, and I'm sure that that's true with other areas as well. Northwest has been fortunate with their yields that they've been able to, they're part of that. So anyway, let's look at some of the information of the raspberry growers. I dug into readily available information, but probably have only scratched the surface. I'm not sure I'll bring anything new to you here who know the raspberry business on that, but that's what we'll focus on this morning. So just kind of give a summary of the topics. We'll talk about the frozen raspberry category, and then the frozen and fresh, because I think they really are, there is some tie between the two of them. And that's why we'll look at the frozen produce berry category. Currency exchange, what's the U.S. berry farmer need to do to survive? And is the complexity today really different than the past? And then a compelling question is, what are the greater challenges to the legacy that we enjoy? Here's a slide that I looked at for looking at frozen raspberry imports plus the Washington, Oregon production. The data that I was able to get from the U.S. Trade Data Center, which is run by the U.S. Bureau of Census, they reported 9 months for 2019, so I've included that. So on the right side of each of these graphs Remember, that's only 9 months. It's not the full year. But what we see here in the orange is the imports of frozen berries have been declining. And while the Washington, Oregon production has been relatively stable, and I'd suggest that we'll probably see the 12 months this year when it ends up someplace between 2017 and 2018. It could reach 2018. But the overall trend here, I think we see on frozen raspberries imported into the U.S. is it's on a bit of a decline. By the way, the committee or the meeting organizers asked that we be careful of using red or blue in our colors. And I've tried to do that. So hopefully that these slides will show for you, try to remove the red and blue. I wanted to look at frozen raspberry imports by country of origin. I've been going to Chile since 1990. When I started going to Chile in 1990, raspberries were a major export from Chile. And so this looks at from 2015 to the 2019 first 9 months, the imports. And Chile still is the major source, but it's gone from over 125 million pounds down to only about 60 million pounds now. That white line across this white line here is the sum total each year. So again, you can see the imports have really been falling significantly from 200 million in 2015 down to about 140 million in 2017. A bit of a hike last year again, but Chile was up again. But then tailing off. This probably again will come out here someplace in this area. I don't expect it to be someplace similar to last year. Serbia, if I'd had to guess, I would not have guessed Serbia to be the number 2 source of frozen berries into the U.S. Mexico is a factor that has been again not growing on the frozen side. And then Canada, of course, which is here at the border and has been a relatively small source of additional berries. Then I went back and looked at fresh raspberries. I did get a little, I've been aware of them, and Henry and I talked a bit, is what's coming in on fresh. And he and I didn't chat about that till this morning, but looking back at the data, it was apparent that your industry's gone to bat with the U.S. Bureau of Census, and you've now, beginning in 2018, began looking at imports of fresh and how they were packaged, and 5 kilograms or less than all others. So 2018 was really the first year that came into play. I'm not even sure it was in play for every month in 13 or in 18, but you can see that the 5 kilogram or less was significantly small, but and with the all other here's a total 176 million pounds of fresh. And then this year, so 9 months, we're starting to see the impact of that reporting data change. 88 million for 9 months, which that'll probably go up to 120, and this will probably at 42 will go up to 60 or so. So we do see this might give some insight into where all the puree stock is coming from. The sort outs, the fresh raspberry, fresh blackberry business. There's a lot of sort outs that come from that business. I've actually got customers that buy, that I still deal with on the blueberry side, that buy raspberry sort outs for concentrating in purees. And then the next slide I have here is raspberry, all sources to the U.S. market. Here's what I'm looking at. This would you could take, this is what's consumed in the U.S. annually. You could kind of think about it in that context. And so domestic fresh is about 200 million pounds a year. You can see it declined a bit. And the reason these are white on domestic fresh here is that the USDA has discontinued reporting domestic production of fresh raspberries. And you probably know the reason why. They're in the hands of too few contacts, so that they don't have a big enough sample to be able to release it publicly. And the Driscoll basically really is the lion of that whole category. And so that's why, and these numbers here then become merely estimates that I've placed in here to give some realistic numbers, or realism to the numbers. Imported fresh, you can see imported fresh, 150 million, but this year went to 200 million last year. And again, this imported fresh includes that packaging that's bigger than 5 kilograms. So this is everything that's imported. So the thing that was interesting to me is to look at the total consumption of raspberries. It's really quite flat. And I was a bit surprised by this. This would be this number, this yellow bar here is all the fresh, domestically produced and imported, and all the frozen, domestically produced and imported. So this would be, in theory, is what's consumed annually in the U.S. in raspberries. So I would suggest really stagnant consumer demand for raspberries. And just to kind of emphasize that more, I wanted to, I pulled this from the California Strawberry Commission's information, and this is the produce department in fresh raspberries only. The last 52 weeks, berries have represented 8.3% of the pounds of produce sold in the supermarket. And this data is from IRI. But they've represented dollar-wise 21% of the dollars produce departments of revenue. Well, if you're a produce manager and you can get 21% of your dollars from 8% of your pounds, what do you want to handle? You handle a lot less pounds and handle a lot less truck loads than et cetera. You want to handle berries. Well, berries have been performing very well in produce. And just as a reference point, in 2000, this number was about 10%. I did a number of presentations back a few years ago, and I remember, and that's, I don't have the exact, but berries at the turn of the century of the total produce sales of supermarkets was about 10% of the category. Today it's 21%. So the retailer loves berries and has been, and because the consumer loves berries, and that category has grown tremendously. Here's the, taking the berry category now, and I know that the size of this is not the best, but here's the pounds of berries. 59% of the strawberries, for example, produced 43% of the dollars. 25% of the blueberries produced 29% of the dollars. That's pretty positive, right? And 7.5% of the raspberries produced 14% of the dollars. That's very positive. And so from a fresh perspective, the raspberry category is doing, the supermarket loves them in that regard because they're a good revenue source with handling a fewer pounds of product. And so that's, we need to recognize that, and I think the impact that we have, that it may have on the sales of frozen. We're discussing in the blueberry industry today the impact of the increased supply of fresh on frozen. And I'll discuss that some tomorrow morning in my blueberry presentation. But the growth of frozen, just as the growth of frozen blueberries, and is something that I worked on for last year for another presentation that did not present it last year here in the blueberry. But I believe the internal growth, the U.S. and Canada, of frozen blueberries is growing only at about 20 million pounds a year. And I can tell you we're packing a lot. Our variance in annual pack is much greater. You come tomorrow morning and we'll look at those numbers. So fresh is clearly best, and fresh produce continues to be the darling of food publicity. It's hard to get good food publicity about frozen berries and how to use them. Fresh is best clearly drives the food category. Organizations who many of we're very much part of, Produce Marketing Association, they lobby heavily in Congress for fresh. And I can almost assure you that if it were not for the fact that schools don't have many days of kids in school during the summertime, we'd see the USDA buying a lot more fresh than what they are frozen. But due to the fact that schools aren't in session, keeps them from doing that, because there's a real push there to buy fresh fruit. Kind of turning now to the export side of this, and I'll leave this slide up for just a minute. A factor often overlooked in planning new acreage is fresh sales are restrained by the limited supply until increased supply fills the pent-up demand. We're seeing, and I'm kind of moving into kind of this big picture now, the price motivating the increased plantings declines after the new supply is delivered. The new plantings are premised on the basis that the price would remain similar with added supply. And although I'm sure that that's not been the case with raspberries here in the Northwest, I can tell you that there's been a lot of blueberries growing the ground based upon prices of fresh fruit that was evident from 2005 to 2010, 12, 13. Those were the glory years of fresh fruit prices for blueberries. But the reason those prices were so high was not necessarily the demand was so great, it was that supply was so short. And we often forget that the law of supply and demand has a supply side, it has a demand side, and it has a price function to it. And we sometimes have a difficulty getting our minds around integrating all those factors into that situation. There's often disappointment when the increased supply yields lower prices. This is particularly true for the fresh market channel and would be similar for frozen market, but the feedback cycle is much longer. You'll see on my slides tomorrow, and again, something I developed a year ago, looking at the big peak of frozen cold storage of blueberries back in 2016 after the wild industry had the huge crop. You start trying to figure out where that went. And if it weren't for exports by the wild industry is what saved us, and that is what moved us out of that really excessive supply situation. My analysis is that domestically, and I'm repeating myself, the supply of frozen berries consumed domestically has not increased much more than 20 million pounds a year. That's about the average. So that's a real challenge for us in the blueberry industry, but I think it also really kind of addresses the frozen raspberry industry as well. If you saw that line tending downward, it's very flat to downward as the frozen raspberries being consumed. Recently, I've engaged with a professional in the fresh market analysis, looking at the relationship of increased supply upon the FOB price point in berries and avocados. And he postulates that when the volume growth for a week is less than 5% of the prior year's volume, the price will prevail. But when the volume growth is 5% greater than the prior year's volume, the price will decline. So if you take last year's volume of 1 for week 45 or for week 35, and you have 1.5 or 1.05 this year, you can maintain last year's prices. But if you have a volume, if you take that 1 and increase it to 1.1 or 1.15, your prices will decline from what they were last year. And he's done a lot of analysis. And it's using USDA data. I've had enough discussion with him. I have a high regard for his analysis, but I think that that's an interesting relationship as to how rapidly we can grow these markets. And again, in many weeks, we're growing them more rapidly than 5% volume. And then the price is declining, and declining to the place that growers' margins are being really squeezed. So just an interesting one. So let's move now to comparative economics and U.S. trade policy. I have to tell you that, comparative economics is Econ 101 and what I'll call ag school. I'm a ag school grad, not a College of Life Sciences, which is, they got all the names changed today, but comparative economics, it still plays out. And lower cost production comes on the scene. Developing economies like Chile and Argentina and Peru and Mexico and Serbia quickly discover opportunities and they fulfill the gaps. My observation, and I've been going to Chile particularly since 1990, and certainly Chile, when I went down to Chile, labor rates there were $5-6 a day. Today, labor rates in Chile are pushing $30 to $40 a day. Still much below ours, but Peru and Mexico are lower cost there. And but historically, U.S. trade policy has been friendly to developing economies, and this is probably a Shelford view. But we're friendly to developing economies. It provides lower cost food to U.S. consumers, and it supports people in developing countries, a favorite policy of the U.S. for many years. This access to U.S. consumers leaves the U.S. farmer in a very unfavorable position. The U.S. higher labor cost availability is not offset by other efficiencies that characterize the American farming practices and professional expertise. And often the imports introduce plant diseases and pests. I'm frankly surprised at the ease with which USDA APHIS permits imports into the U.S. Compared to the requirements other nations place upon U.S. imports, it seems without reason, in my opinion. And if you want to get that conversation going, just live in Florida and talk with the citrus growers. The citrus growers in Florida will, you get a discussion going about APHIS and what they've allowed and not allowed. You can have a really pretty interesting discussion, and that with a lot of blame placed upon the imports. And of course, with the SWD, where did that come into the country from? And would have imports kept it from coming into the country? I don't know the answer to that, but we certainly believe it was introduced. So currency exchange is one we often hear about. I often hear about it. I often kid about it with my friends in Canada because we do quite a bit of business in Canada. But we'd be remiss to not look at currency exchange rates, particularly it relates to the berry industry. Major trading nations for berries have realized much gain in the last 5 years in this regard. And I've just put up a few slides here just to look at that, and I'm sure it's very clear here in this country, but here's the currency of US dollar to Canadian dollar since 2013. They're now running 20, well, this line here is 30% greater than what they were. So the bottom line of it is a Canadian grower selling $1 beginning here in this area here, 2015, he sells a pound of berries into the U.S. at $1. He revenues $1.30 Canadian. Now, my friends in Canada tell me their costs are 30% higher. I'd suggest, and there's many of you here who know both sides of the border, and I won't get into that debate with you other than that did your cost increase that significantly in a 2-year period of time? And that's an interesting discussion. I put up another slide here with says Mexico is also. Mexico has gone from a $13, $14 exchange rate to it's been running $19. I'm on the board of a company that's primary income is sourced in revenue, primary growing. We grow this company grows in Mexico and in Arizona. It's in the organic vegetable business, greenhouse. And I can tell you that our costs in Arizona are significantly higher than our costs in our Mexican greenhouse operations are. And certainly the peso's value going from 14 to 19 has been very helpful to us. And in our Mexican operations, it's important we have the U.S. side operation. Where there's never been any regret, and that was one of the things I encouraged them to do when I became part of their organization, was to begin growing in the U.S. to legitimize their company. And that's an interesting statement because many supermarkets, if you don't have a U.S. base, you're not as seen as favorably by their eyes as if you do. And that clearly, we had, after we put our greenhouse in Arizona, we had more supermarket buyer and merchandiser visits than that year that we built it than we had in our prior 15 years of history. the buyers and a lot of corporate policy will not let them go outside of the country. And so and I think that's something we need to remember as U.S. growers, and probably I should say U.S. Canadian growers. There wouldn't be a reluctance to go to Canada, but we need to remember that there's some real benefits for being in the U.S. Here's the U.S. dollar to Chilean peso. Again, you go back to this 2014. Where is it today? What happens when social unrest comes along? Look where the social unrest has shifted. I've used as a general number 650 pesos for the last 5 years. This last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, they've been trading as high as 800 pesos. So social unrest can really drive currency, and that's something just to kind of remember as we look around the world and see all the social unrest and what drives currency values. Here's the U.S. dollar to the Peruvian solo. And again, you see, now Peruvians knew most of the planning and development in Peru has all taken place since 2014, 15, but they've also realized the same. So the dollar is strong. Here's even the dollar to the euro. And if you'd asked me to predict this relationship 15 years ago, I probably would have said, I don't think it'll happen. But the euro today, since that 2015 time period, the euro now is devalued compared to the U.S. dollar. So the U.S. dollars really been riding very high. Then, in trading, I put this up slide. Why is the dollar so strong? And I put it up here because we oftentimes want to we kind of don't like the fact the dollar is so strong, because it puts us as U.S. growers in a very contrary position. But this is the 10 most traded currencies in the USA in the world in 2018. Look where the U.S. dollar is. 90% of the world currency trade is U.S. dollars. You want to know why the dollar is strong? As much as we internally have a lot of apprehension about our dollar, the world still believes the dollar is a place to be. The euro is 31%, yen 21%, British pound 12%, and so on. I just found this information exceedingly interesting as we look at some of the challenges we face, because as growers we want to say, what can we change? Well, that's probably not something we can change. So what action is available to the U.S. berry farmer? And certainly the petition trade restrictions based upon dumping. We see the battle that goes on in the Florida tomato growers. They've been doing this for years. We've got the Florida-Georgia blackberry growers, Florida-Georgia strawberry blueberry growers are really trying to raise a lot of cane, and I would say to have some trade restrictions placed upon Mexico. And I guess my comment here is, you folks in the red raspberry business here in Washington have seen this. You've petitioned it yourself. You've done it in the past. You've had tariffs on imports. I understand that you've got another effort going to do some import restrictions. The problem becomes is how do they work, and how did they work? I guess I would say, how's the tomato growers in Florida? How are they working for them? Well, if you live in Van Buren County, which is where I live, it's one of the largest growing tomato counties in Florida. They're still growing a lot of tomatoes there, but most of those companies, and I was with Gargiulo, that's what took me to Florida. Gargiulo was doing tomatoes they were growing tomatoes in Mexico at the same time they were growing in Florida. And that's really happening today. They are growing both sides of the border. And so, I think one of the areas that when we look for trade restrictions, we also need to probably consider, can I take my expertise elsewhere and invest it and grow where it's lower cost? And one of the companies that I've worked with since 1990, Hortifruit, Certainly, Victor Muller's one of his compelling drives was, I need to know where the lowest cost producers are all the time. And although he was much more willing to travel the world to plant than what we are, he did that. So, you know, I guess I really wonder how effective we can be in that area, because, you know, we're less than 2% of the population today, or 1% or whatever. And farmers, most of the American people believe they can walk into a store and get their food. They don't realize the food comes from your farm and farmers up and down the byways of America. Promote U.S. grown berries, locally grown. I would say that we need to do more on that than we do. I frankly am very surprised about the traction that locally grown has gotten amongst consumers. When it first started being promoted, I was not confident it would have a lot of success, because if I talk in my neighborhood and talk to people, ask them where their berries were that they bought last week, they don't know if they were from Argentina or Chile. I'm amazed how we push country of origin, yet when I talk to consumers in the store, in my neighborhood, and people I run into, few of them know where the berries that they bought last week were from. On the frozen bags, I turn over the bag of frozen all the time. I'm in the business and look, where's the country of origin? And, you know, and it's on there, but may I assure you that consumers, that doesn't impact their buy. And that's regretful, but I think we could have the government doing more in that area if you want the government involvement in it. And I'm not a big fan there, but certainly that is one. Is export a more viable alternative for berry farmers? The track record indicates this is a challenging path. And we compare that to what's taken place to date. We haven't done very well on export on either fresh berries or on frozen berries from the high bush industry. A success in export is that we've had in the high bush blueberry industry has been with the wild industry. They've done quite well, and out of Canada. And I did put together some data from export of frozen raspberries. I didn't put it on the charts I brought, but it is readily available. But I think one of the things that I've heard on frozen, we don't know how to pack for frozen. And I know some of you folks from the Northwest pack for frozen, and the frozen quality standard it's very tough compared to what most American buyers will buy. You've got to really be at the very top of your game. I've had folks say that if we try to prepare an industry to export, the preparation needs to begin at the farm level and the packing level, because we get so concerned with reducing trade barriers, but a reduced trade barrier will not win the market. Superior product with reduced trade barrier will win the market, and we're not very good at producing superior product as is perceived in the eyes of some of the customers. Consumer demand, I go back to what I talked about. Where's the opportunity to increase the share of dollars to raspberries, to other berries? Do fresh sales cannibalize frozen sales? I would suggest, even the data we looked at this morning, that it may be. It's hard for me to believe that someone that would use a frozen raspberry would use a fresh raspberry. But the fresh raspberry, you walk into the store, what's the big display? It sure isn't the frozen case, it's the fresh case. And and I'm on the promotion committee of the U.S. High Bush Blueberry Council. We're looking very distinctly today whether there's cannibalization of frozen today by fresh, as the fresh increases tremendously. So that's, then there's always the issue, and consumers always want new. Every customer, and we have customers, bring us something new. Bring it. The new is the new is the new, and what is new. And, I come back, I'm kind of with Solomon. What has been is what will be. What has been is what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun. And in my lifetime, and being a dairy farmer, it wasn't too many years ago, probably 40, we weren't to eat butter, were we? Butter was supposed to be the worst thing in the forest. eat all the corn fat. Well, today it's just the opposite. And that's just an example. And when's milk not milk? I'm convinced today that one of the things that's driving the almond milk industry isn't so much that it's necessary health, but it's new. And it won't be. We'll cycle back around, and all of a sudden, milk will be milk again. But and I know many of you in this room have dairy farm backgrounds as well. But milk will be milk again someday. But we have to live through those times until we get there. There's lots of other issues, environmentally sensitive, sustainable practices, labor practices, and so forth. And I see my time's about up, but complexity appears immense compared to 50 years ago. I just would ask the question, is it? I don't want to go back and find out. My father and his brother moved from the hill farm to the better farm or terrain of the Finger Lakes. Today, the hill farm is again woods and likely not very good timber. It may be for those who have gone before us, it may be that those who have gone before us were more willing to accept failure's risk, turning sour and having to start again. It may be that their trust in the Lord and in providence provided them a hope that far exceeds the hope found in man's inventions and ways. A question that and I hope I can wrap this up quickly because I know we're supposed to be here at noon, but the trade policy, China, human rights, socialism, communism, and national debt. Lots of topics there, far more than we could ever cover, but I would just say there's one of your own here in Washington State, Desmond O'Rourke, who wrote an article or an editorial in the American Fruit Grower a year ago in August. Many of you know him. This is the quote that he wrote there. The China-U.S. struggle is much more than a trade dispute. It is part of a mammoth leadership battle between the two economic titans about whose policies, whose philosophy, whose economic system, and human rights concerns will prevail globally in the 21st century. China's goal is to displace, this is not his quote, end of quote. China's goal is to displace the United States to be the dominant world economy, dominant world military, and dominant world governing body. The path is clear. I was in South Africa back in April, and I was observing some couple of public transportation, public works projects, and asked the people we were with, who funded them? China. And so China is pouring billions of dollars into Africa and around the world elsewhere. And then I also get very, in America today, we have a lot of concern with fair trade. We have a lot of concern with fair labor practices. We're involved with doing fair trade certification on our farm, certifying we're treating our labor well, we're paying them basically the wages. But why aren't we concerned about that with nations like China? The ongoing suppression of freedoms is evident. Hong Kong, look at the Hong Kong demonstrations and the recent election. I'm just amazed. Would we fight for our freedom the way those college students are fighting for and continue to fight to have just freedom of expression? The suppression of the Christian church after several decades of relative freedom is not just the Christian church, the murderous treatment of the Uyghurs Muslims in Western China. I don't know how much you watch that, but it isn't, in China, it doesn't matter what belief system you have. If you have a belief system that isn't going to support the total secularization and give the Chinese leadership, you're worthy of murder for them. They have no place for you in that culture, and they're continuing to prove it. Is this new? Not at all. This is just a quote from The Guardian on February of 2002. The 20th century was the most murderous in the recorded history. The total number of deaths caused by or associated with the wars in the 20th century estimated 187 million, the equivalent of more than 10% of the world's population in 1913. I was born in 1945. That means in that century in which I was born, in which I will have spent the majority of my life in, was 187 million people were killed. Why was I born in America? Why was I born? I think the Bob Martins, I didn't have anything to do about where I was born. And that statement is so true that we don't realize how that in this, we need to be the defenders of personal freedom. Mao Zedong was the greatest mass murderer in world history. Just a couple of things here. He was enforcing the Great Leap Forward in 1958. And from 1958 to 1962, they believe between facing a famine, systematic torture, brutality, starvation, and killing of Chinese peasants to the Second World War in magnitude. 45 million people were worked, starved, or beaten to death in China over those years. The worldwide death toll of the Second World War is 55 million. 45 million in China between 56 and 58 and 62, and 55 million in World War II. Folks, I believe that we need to realize that China's Belt and Road Initiative is to win the world and is to dominate the world, and it's at the cost of human life and human freedom. There's others here I just put a couple things up here that I thought, and I'm sorry for here's a compelling question. I've got that. This is an interesting slide. I just wanted to put some perspective. I think so often we listen to the media and we don't get the right perspective. Here's the top trading partners in 2018. China was $659 billion, 15% of our trade. But look at where Canada and Mexico were in 2018. They equal 29% of our trade. We need to be building our trade with Canada and Mexico. Look at now this year, 2019, for the first 9 months, China's fallen to only 13%. Canada and Mexico are now bigger than China in our trading partners. If you listened to the media, would you have known this? Would you have guessed that? I don't think so. And we so need to get back to, let's really start to look at some facts and quit and not what someone wants to believe necessarily. So socialism. I just wanted socialism. This one here is just astounding. 70% of millennials, by a recent YouGov poll, believe that they're extremely likely to vote for a socialistic candidate. Well, I make a proposal today that socialism depends. We're already well on to socialism. Socialism is not new. The national debt today is $23 trillion. An annual it exceeds 1 year of our annual GDP of $21 trillion. We often talk about China holding our debt. China only holds $1.1 trillion of our debt. You know who holds the debt? You and I do. 74%. The Social Security Fund owns the debt. So, and I personally believe that the greatest threat to our future, it may be today we see it as imports from Mexico or Chile, or maybe the consumer's not paying the price for our product. But I believe that these truths, that this national debt is absolutely a threat to our future, a far greater threat than anything we will face in our own industry. So just some thoughts. Debt funds today's desires at tomorrow's expense. And isn't that what socialism does? Takes from somebody else and spends it on themselves. And so we need to put the debt issue far more in place. You know, I visited Russia 5 times in the 90s and early 2000s. I've been in India, been in South Africa now, been in Israel. And I can tell you, this country still is the defender of human rights around the world. And when communism is rebounding back in Russia, and I can tell you the thing that blew me out of the water when I went to Russia after the Reagan years and the wall came down and all that, they said, "Oh yeah, no more state-owned farms. We're going to sell them." You know who owned all the state-owned farms and probably were giving them? The members of the Communist Party. So there's still 3% of the people that owned the farms, and that became very clear and very evident as you sat in the kitchens of these folks and started just having a conversation. So thank you for your attention today. I trust the information has stirred some ideas and innovative juices, and we need to remember some of these legacies that are worth fighting for that I put up here on the screen to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry to hold you up. I've been to Chile, And as a raspberry grower, I was really surprised that they could be able to produce that much poundage because that land is so skinny and long, and the climates. I mean, so the climate area. Where in the world do they raise that much? And the next question is, do you know anything about Hascap berry?
I know very little about Hascap other than what I've seen at a couple of trade shows where the Hascap promoters are promoting it. Chili is, that's one of the things is chili in the raspberry business has probably got a very, as you see, the numbers are declining rapidly. They've been declining rapidly. Food safety will put many of the raspberry growers out of business because they were growing on 1 and 2 acre farms. There's no way that they can meet the food safety requirements that are coming today. I would suggest to you that the raspberries will become insignificant. By the way, that frozen, I don't think it showed so much, but looking at total frozen imports into the U.S., Mexico's essentially 99.5% of them. Half of 1% comes from Chile, Serbia, and other nations. When you look at those, that total import, that was fascinating. So,
thank you.
I had a question about one of your slides where you had the currency trading up there, and you said that 90% of the trade was in U.S. dollars. Just looking at that slide, there was way more than 100% on there.
That's
and
right.
So I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah, because there's 2 sides to all the currency trade, so it was 200% what you'll find. There's both sides of the trade. So it's a 200%. Good question. Good catch. Good question. That was in the notes underneath the slide that I picked up on that as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again. Please remember your assessments are always important. So in the back of your chairs, if you can take a look at that app, or if you haven't already, go ahead and make a couple of notes. We'll be back at 1:30. So it's lunchtime now. We have a break, but we'll be back in here at 1:30.